So we are starting to see the end of the tunnel and are now ready to load the data in the database. For this particular project, I will be using Postgres as a SQL server. And to save us time, I make sure everything that I'm going to show you now is actually working. There are a few things that I also did in the background before doing the load. One is I did transfer the CSV files to the database server. The reason is these files are fairly large, so instead of streaming the CSV file from my computer to the remote database server, it will be faster for the server to have access to the files locally. So I simply copied them to a location where the SQL server can access directly. The other thing that I did is I took the SQL script that were generated by Metasheet and made a copy of them in a different folder and also renamed them. The reason for that, I just want to make sure, because I'm going to make some slight modification to the scripts, I just want to make sure they do not get overwritten whenever I rerun Metasheet again. So I just place a copy alongside where the data files are. So we have this CLIA PostgreSQL and the other PostgreSQL. Now I opened the scripts and I made a few changes to kind of customize them a little bit for the environment. So one thing that I did is I first renamed the file. It was, I think, called provider CLIA. In this case, I gave it a slightly longer name. I'm going to load this in my Postgres database into the US schema, and I might have all the table there down the road, so I want to make sure I have a name that represents what the data table is and contains. So I call this CMS provider CLIA, and I also put a date on there because this data set gets updated quarterly. So when the next version comes up, I can create a different table, load the data in, and load the new data and adjust accordingly. At the end, also, I added a little import statement here. This is a line that's gonna, after the table is created, is gonna load the CSV file into the table. For practical reason, I did a couple of lines to do some QA. Just want to make sure the data is loaded, do a quick count of the number of records and a quick cross-tabulation. And we also create a view on top of the physical table. This is something that I strongly advise when you're going to access this database table in your SQL server for analytical purposes, or in our case, for exposing it through an API. You never want to hit the table directly because the table might change. As we know, there's going to be another version down the road. So I always have an overarching view that isolates the consumer or the user or the analyst from the actual physical table. Tables may change, the view remains the same, one can be tweaked. And the other advantage of this, in a view, I could add a few derived or computed variables that did not exist in the original data set. So we're now ready to load this in, and at this point, I know everything is working. I had to do a few tweaks also to the data types. Some of the count variables that were in the other files were actually not all integers, and there are some decimal points and stuff like that. So we did some tweaks of the variable metadata in the metasheet and regenerated. But once you have all that together, loading the data is almost trivial. This script here was generated by Metasheet. I didn't have to write any of this. So I'm going to take the CLIA file, press enter on the create table statement, and this is going to call my database server and create a new table. So if I go under my table, do a refresh, now I'm going to get this new table showing up under here. Let me refresh this again. Oh, it's just refreshing. It's taking a little while, I think. Okay, here we go. So I do have my new table created here. And then the next thing I just need to do is to scroll down to my copy statement. That's going to load the CSV data into the table. This is a fairly large data set, like I think 200 megabytes or something. So it will take a few seconds, but not that long. Postgres is pretty good. And we are done, so we can see that 447,000 rows have been imported here. And then I'm quickly gonna double check. I have this little QA. It's gonna run this thing and tells me that yes, I have 547, 510 rows loaded. You can also do a quick cross tabulation with the state code and the count by state, just to make sure all the states are populated. And you can see the numbers here. And then I'm going to create my view on top of it, the provider CLIA, that I'm going to use later on, that at this point use the 2012 version. That is the only one we have. And now I do have a view. So if I refresh the views here, I'm going to find both the table in the view. And if I open the view, I'm going to find the data that we just loaded. And you can look at it as a grid as well. No, the only thing I need to do is to repeat the same thing for the other files, which is this one. The script is obviously different because the variables are different. So I'm just going to run this script, create the table. We're going to refresh, and hopefully this time we're good. Here we go. Go to the import statements. Scroll. This is a longer. This contains variables from 18 different files, which is why it's a bit of a mixed bag. Run the copy statement. Oh, wrong line. I'm going to run the copy statements. And oh yeah, that's the interesting one. This one is the one that contains the special characters. You may recall we noticed this when we were looking at the CSV file doing the Python thing. So here I'm just going to tell Postgres that this should be a Latin 1, not a UTF-8 file, which is basically what typically a server would expect. But we know we're using the UTF-8 encoding. So I'm going to switch to a Latin 1 encoding. And now the file will be processed properly. In this case, we have 152,000 rows. Likewise, I just double check. I do have the count. I do a little cross tabulation by state. We have providers in every state, which is what we expect. And then I'm going to create the CMS provider other view on top of my physical table. I'm going to refresh. Do a refresh here. Just do a quick peek at the data to make sure everything is in there. We do seem to have the data populated. And that is about it. We are downloading the data in the database. The key thing is, again, all this script, we don't have to type any of that. That's all generated off the metadata, which is the advantage of using some of these things. I'm going to save this guy here. And now the data is ready for analysis. So in a traditional environment, you could simply connect directly to the SQL database and do various things on this table. What we're going to do next is to register this table into a Rich Data Services platform, and then the data will be available through the RDS API as well as the web application that we will use to show what it looks like on the web. So that's going to be for the next segment.